And welcome to everyone who's joined us. Hi, Lucy. Hope you're well. And welcome to everyone else who's joining us on YouTube. Once again, we've got Elena in tonight. How are you, Elena?
I'm very good, thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us on our Thursday night Space Store live talks. So, do you want to tell everyone what you're going to be talking about tonight?
Sure. So you'll all have seen the title of the talk, which is Unconventional Careers from Nature Lover to Space Expert. And I'm going to use my own career experience to just give an example of how you can definitely have a career in space at any point in your life, whether you're just starting up or actually a lot later in life. And just to say that if you really pursue your passion and remain open, great things can happen that you could never imagine.
Definitely, yeah. And for those of us who are joining us now, Elena, do you want to just give them a background of what you do currently in the space industry?
Yes. So you've actually caught me at an interesting point in time in my career. And by the way, I apologize as I'm trying to share my screen as I do this, and multitasking is a skill that I tend to pride on, but doesn't always work perfectly. So hopefully we're there. So actually, as it happens, I'm right now in a transition from a career point of view. So I wanted to provide a few examples actually of things that I've done that make this talk meaningful for everyone. So a few of the things that I've done in space involve different collaborations with NASA, both on the laser side and on the satellite side. I've supported the UK Space Agency in a fantastic international collaboration called the International Charter Space and Major Disasters, which currently brings together about 17 space agencies all over the world collaborating to help countries that are going through natural disasters. I've worked at a wonderful organization, Satellite Applications Catapult, where I actually got to work with the founder of Space Store. And I was the lead of satellite applications for sustainable development. So looking at how we can live our lives more sustainably everywhere, but especially in the developing world. I recently worked at a startup that is aiming to deliver video for satellites for the good and the benefit of humanity. And if you're spacer aficionados, people in the audience, you may actually have seen me present live when we could still get together in person on this topic last year.
Awesome. I think you've had such a glittering career in the space industry so far. Many people will be wondering, well, they'll be wondering there's so much they can learn from you over this next hour or so. So what I'm going to do is just welcome a few of our guests. Hi, Dipali. Thank you for joining us, and a warm welcome to everyone who's now joining us on YouTube. Once again, we've got Dr. Elena Lobo in tonight for another incredible talk. And without further ado, I'm going to let you take it away, Elena. I'm going to disappear for a little bit, but please do send in your questions if you have any for Elena through the chat on Zoom or via the chat under the YouTube video. And then around 6 o'clock, I'll pop back on and we'll try and answer some questions with Elena.
Perfect. So
awesome.
Thanks everyone for showing up today. I hope you've had a great day wherever you're based. And the beauty of doing this virtual as opposed to in person is that obviously, hopefully it gives a lot more people the chance to join, even if you are a bit further away. So just for those of you who haven't caught me yet, or that have joined just a few minutes later, today's talk is really using my own career experience to talk you through how you can, at any point in your life, find yourself with an exciting career in space. And you don't need to have planned it from the start. You can really jump on it at any point. And so hopefully by talking you through my journey, you can see how this happened. And I've also worked with people who, you know, in their 40s and 50s decided that space was very exciting and came from completely different fields, such as finance or banking, and went into deep space technology. So this is really possible. That's one of the amazing things that our beautiful changing world has on offer for us today. And so without further ado, I'm going to bring you over to the start, where these things start for me, and why do I go you know, I was and I am a nature lover, and how did I become a space expert? So I grew up in Spain, where I'm originally from, in southern Spain. And the three things that were really at the core and center of my life were big family. And you can see there on the top left what people in Spain looked like in the 80s and early 90s. So kind of little flashback for those who were alive then, and hopefully a fun, cool look into what previous generations used to look like for those of you who are younger. So big family, which meant I absolutely love being around people, interacting with people, working with people. And this has had a deep impact in my career in the long term that I couldn't have suspected, you know, when I was growing up. Then on the right, you will see actually my closest family, so my siblings, my mom, and my dog, and we are out in nature. We're in the mountains, and I was lucky to have every summer with my family, with my close family, going to nature. So that's the little map on the left-hand side. It's not customized for me, but it really means that travel, going places, being outdoors was a big part of my growing up, and something that is still very close to my heart. So every time I'm outside in nature, I'm in complete bliss. But it also gave me a very, I guess, unconscious realization of just the geography of things, where things are, what it takes to go from one place to another. So this is a start. And for those of you who are young and maybe trying to figure out what you do with your career and your life, as you can see, nothing relating to space here yet. No clue. If you asked me as a child, would you want to be working with space agencies and satellite technologies to look at disasters or sustainable development? Couldn't have imagined it in a million years. But that was the seed. These planted a seed for what would happen later in my life and my career. And so when it got time to go to college to study at university, I had no model for anyone working in space, or in fact, studying things relating to space careers, or even to location, to geography. So what I did in a very sort of systematic scientific way is I printed out the curricula of all of the degrees that I thought might interest in me, looked at them and decided, and then started subsetting them by the ones that I thought I would enjoy studying, but also I would enjoy working at. And I ended up with a Master's of Engineering in Natural Resource Management. And so this, again, it's another piece of the puzzle. And this is what I also want to reiterate to those of you who are still maybe early in your careers and you don't necessarily know, oh, do I want to go this direction or this other direction? So when I did this degree, I chose it because it involved working with nature, but also it involved the ability to influence, to make changes, and to make a better world for people. So already in this first career choice, you can see how some of the things that I grew up with that were important values to me were already influencing the direction I was taking. But I have to say that choosing an engineering degree had a strong impact in the way that I would progress and see my career later. Because the first day that they told us when we got to this degree was, you are an engineer. It is your job to solve any problem and any issue that emerges. There are no excuses, no justifications. You are responsible. You figure out the way and sort that out. And that was a fantastic seed for understanding I had all the power. It was always in my hand to figure out things, to figure out and to carve out a journey that would take me where I wanted to be. And while they meant it, obviously, for engineering problems in natural resource management, that was actually a learning that would work out very valuable in life altogether. And another aspect that was really valuable and that came from this engineering degree is that we tend to sometimes simplify systems, and that is good for us to understanding these systems, right? So we structure them, we organize them, sort of like the diagram that you see on the bottom left. But when you're dealing with life and with nature, things are more complex than our simplified versions. So while it's useful to create these systems understanding, we have to realize that they are just a way to see life in a way that's easier for us. But life itself is complicated, is hyper connected. There are a lot of mechanisms at play, and keeping that in mind is always useful, so that when we do something and it doesn't work out the way we thought, we can look at it again and understand the connections and the links that we may have missed. So in this career, in this degree, there were two subjects that really caught my attention. So one of them was the topic of geospatial. So just figuring out where things are. And I think, again, this took on probably from my childhood when, we traveled to all these places and went to all these different locations. And the understanding of where things were and how that impacted, what happened in that environment, the local, the regional, the wider environment, that was huge. And that was the early days of geospatial software. So if there's anyone in the audience that does geospatial, one of the largest software providers in the world right now, Esri, was on their second version. They're now, I think, on the 11th of the 12th of their software. So you get a sense on how early days it was. But the second topic that I found fascinating was remote sensing. So, getting information from things from afar. And that covered all sorts of remote sensing, definitely satellite remote sensing, or what we call today Earth observation, but also, sensors that you could put on airplanes, on boats, in the trees, everywhere. And just the availability of information that could be collected from afar and how that could be used to understand these very complex systems in a much deeper way. That's something that definitely caught my attention. And so you can see actually these two here, which I have illustrated. So on the left-hand side, you have the remote sensing side of things. And this is actually a graphic from the National Science Foundation in the US, who I got to get funding from later on in life. And on the right-hand side, you have all these geographic layers. So the science of the where, which puts all of these pieces of information together and let us understand that where things are is important. There are many things that are important, but where things are is important. And we need to build a fuller picture of the world that we're trying to understand and to simplify. And so that took me to my next career step. So I spent actually a little bit of time working as a research assistant, and I actually joined a development NGO in Latin America, because I was lucky enough to be exposed through my master's to the amazing nature and landscapes of the tropics. And I got a chance to go to Africa, and I got a chance to go to Asia, because I had a fantastic professor. And so when it came time to think about a PhD, I went, well, I haven't been to one of the other continents, so let's try America. And so I found myself applying for a few scholarships and getting one of them, and then being able to choose between different professors. And I ended up going with a professor in the US, but with a research site in Panama in Latin America. So that image that you see there is actually where the research site that I worked at for my thesis is, and that is actually the Panama Canal. So here's where a few of the things that had started to emerge previously and that I was so passionate about continued in my career in the way that I chose to do things. So I went with a topic that would keep me close to nature, because again, that was very close to my heart. I've always loved being in nature and it just makes me happy. And so those were the sites where I would do my field work. So you can see they're just like the amazing tropical forest that you can see. But I carried forward and I actually put a great emphasis on the two knowledge areas that I had found in my earlier studies. So geographic location and Earth observation from satellites were a big part of what I did for my PhD. And this was a whole other adventure. It ended up, bringing a lot of challenges and definitely a lot of thinking on my side, and some fantastic opportunities that I would never have thought of. So in the process of creating a topic that was unique, that was interesting, that would bring some value to humanity, and that I would develop, I ended up landing in trying to understand human impacts on tropical forests and how can we detect and measure those impacts, and how long do they stay in those ecosystems after we've been there. And so it turned out that using all these technologies, using remote sensing, both actually from air, using radar, and using satellite images in the most conventional sense, gave me power to look at this at a much wider scale than had ever been done before. So traditionally, these studies are done in very small plots where people go through the field and measure every tree and have these instruments, and they do these over very, very small areas. So for those of you who are familiar with area units, the biggest areas that get ever measured in this way are about 50 hectares, but very often 1 hectare or 10 hectares. So really, really small pieces of land. And by using these technologies, I could look at, tens and hundreds of square kilometers of forest and just have a much wider sense of how these things were happening. But because this was very new, which is what a PhD is supposed to do, it meant that I got to have collaborations with NASA, with the US Geographical Survey, with big technology companies in the US, because that's where I was doing my PhD, that had amazing instruments to collect tons of information. And so it was a really big experience in applying my earlier concept as an engineer. If there is an issue, it's your job to solve it. No excuses. You just have to figure out a way. So trying many ways of figuring this out. But just actually identifying, by having this drive and this persistence, identifying exciting collaboration opportunities and bringing extremely knowledgeable people on board from these great organizations to work, because they would also get to develop an interesting piece of research or a new discovery. And so that was a great experience. And we're now going to coming back to the UK, where I actually did my master's thesis in University of Aberdeen. So as I was developing my PhD, PhDs in the US are very long. And I decided towards the end, I should be working at the same time, because otherwise I would go crazy writing my thesis and writing all these articles for scientific journals, which is quite is quite a demanding task from a mental point of view. So I actually started working for a very small company in Panama, where I was at the time, that would deliver information to all sorts of organizations, including, for instance, some government ministries, using these types of technologies. So because I knew the technologies very well and I had studied them very deeply, it was a pretty straightforward job for me to do from a technology point of view. It definitely brought a completely different dimension, which is tailoring your technology approach to the question or the problem that people are trying to solve. But so in this process, I was going to an event to present one of my papers at a conference in Australia, and I came across someone from a very small company also in the UK that was dealing with monitoring of the earth for helping countries with disaster response. And these really caught my interest. And as serendipity would have it, there was a job opening that came up in this company, and I applied. And I had to meet up with the CEO and the head of commercial on Christmas Eve while I was coming to visit my family in Europe, because I was across the ocean, and they ended up offering me a job. Which meant just as I was trying to complete my thesis and defend it in the US, I actually took a job here in the UK, working for a company that coordinated the disaster monitoring constellation of satellites, which you can see there on the right. And this opportunity opened up so many other activities for me in my space career that, again, I could have never thought of, because sure, I was using satellites and I was pretty good at it, but I was using all sorts of other technologies. So at no point had I said, my career is going to be all about satellites. This is it for me. But I took the jump, I took the job, and actually the picture, so I came to Guildford, for that job. And the picture that you can see there in the middle, I think is my second week of work. And it was actually the annual event where we brought together all of the country members of the disaster monitoring constellation, because each of the satellites was managed and owned by a different country, and they worked in collaboration, and then all sorts of other partners. So already, a couple of weeks into the job, I'm, surrounded by people from space agencies, from all over, from scientific agencies using this satellite data. And it was a fantastic immersion, but it also opened up a whole other area that I could have never anticipated. And so my highlight of this period, and again, kind of happened fortuitously just by staying open, was supporting the UK Space Agency in this fantastic initiative that is called the International Charter Space and Major Disasters. So this is a collaboration across space agencies. It started very small with 3-4 space agencies about 20 years ago. So it was Canada, France, I think the European Space Agency, and maybe one more as at the very, very start, with the intention to share satellite data in support of disaster response for countries all across the world. And sure enough, it was a big effort, and it took a lot of a lot of time and a lot of countries joining to get it to where it is today, where I think it's circa, again, it's between 15 and 20 space agencies that are members today, but they really will provide data to countries anywhere through directly if they become users of the charter, or through other organizations such as the UN if the countries don't feel that they have the capacity. So this is definitely has been like probably the best highlight of my career. On the one hand, because you know that the work that you do is directly helping people in a complex situation. So if you are up for 24 hours waiting for the images to come, to send them across, to talk to the person in the country, to get them some maps so that they can prioritize the response, you know that that has a very direct impact on people's lives. But also because of the community of space agencies. So I have to say the crowd of people that work in these initiatives from all those space agencies, they are extremely giving. They will go out of their way to help. And there are, despite of the countries obviously not agreeing in political issues in many other dimensions, when it came to the charter, there are no politics, there is nothing, there is a very clear mandate and driver to help people. And so this was a fantastic time for me. So there you can actually see the 15th year anniversary celebrations from the creation of the charter, which I was happy I was just lucky enough to be part of, and we're in the US standing in front of their facilities with all the other delegations and just getting together to figure out how to make this initiative even better. So I am just about to wrap up because I really want to interact with you and hopefully to get questions and to help with other things. But just to say that from that first job here in the UK, in Guildford, Surrey, I've actually been lucky enough to have, to work at other places such as Satellite Applications Catapult, such as SEN, which is a startup aiming to deliver video from satellites. And I'm actually now collaborating with a couple of colleagues who have just founded their new company called Impact Space. And so just to say that this is a fun journey that you may have noticed, for those of you who are very observant, that I had little red dots all along the presentation. And I'll sort of quote Steve Jobs here, but looking back, it's easy to put the dots together and to make sense of the decisions that I made in life. But when you're living it at the moment, you don't necessarily know when you make those choices where they will take you. And for me, the key learnings have been stay open, stay curious, and if an opportunity comes up and it seems really exciting, no matter how impossible or unfeasible it looks, go for it because you will not regret it. So with that, I'm wrapping, but I wanted to leave you with a space image for the Q&A so that we have a lovely background.
Awesome, thank you so much, Elena. And honestly, I'm speechless. Like, you've described such a fascinating journey and such a fascinating career, from how you went, like, you just love nature, and then it took you to Panama, and then you discovered how the space industry can play such a role in nature, and obviously hundreds of different more applications. But honestly, so fascinating, and thank you so much for such an amazing talk. There's actually a question coming in already from Sophie Hannon. Thank you, Sophie, for your question. And Sophie's asking, would you say your wider geographical knowledge has given you a different outtake on the space industry?
Yes, actually, I would say that has been extremely helpful, because the space sector is quite wide, but definitely the space industry, so the commercial side of things, actually is very different across regions and continents. So having been able to experience definitely the US side, the European side, and through the international collaborations, actually, some of the other very strong countries, definitely in Asia, India, China, Japan, but very emerging, a lot of emerging countries. There are very significant differences. And so that has been quite helpful to kind of get the whole broad scope.
Yeah, I think I was just thinking about that. You've mentioned you love traveling, and because of that traveling, you've been able to meet so many different people, especially those who are kind of high up in different space agencies. How would you describe your experience with the likes of the different space agencies you worked with through the natural disaster response unit?
Sure. Yes. So, I mean, this is a combination of actually how the space agencies are structured, which again, the way that they're structured actually can quite significantly differ across countries in the mandate and the remit that they take. So, for instance, some of the very well-known space agencies, such as NASA, they have a big operational capacity on top of the research, etc. And that is definitely the case for many others. Whereas in some cases, definitely with the newer or smaller space agencies, they focus much more on a niche or a particular area rather than covering the broad full spectrum of what you can do with satellites, which is a
Yeah,
lot.
yeah,
But also the way that people work, right? And this is where the cultural aspect
yeah.
makes a huge difference. So, for instance, some countries have traditionally in their societies very hierarchical structures, and these structures percolate to every aspect of their lives, including space agencies.
Mhm.
And so having an understanding of how the structures work, which influence their processes, and being able to work effectively with them versus, for instance, other countries where no matter what level you're at, people just talk to each other. So you can have the most junior person and the CEO of the organization talking in the same place. It's a very different dynamic. And again, kind of understanding those differences, even from, even just for an operational activity such as the charter. Well, you need to organize together and bring all this information together, makes a big difference in how you communicate with people, what you expect, how they set up to do these things.
Yeah, awesome. I think Dipali Lodya has just said that she really enjoyed your talk, and she says thank you. So I'm really glad you enjoyed that, Dipali. So you just mentioned the disaster response charter, and I think you're doing an absolutely amazing job with using satellite technology to help essentially effectively save lives. But you said that it's quite a high pressure situation because you're kind of waiting because satellites, of course, so they don't always comply, do they?
No.
And you just have to wait. You're just staring at a screen for data to appear. So, like, how have you found that the balance between like the high pressure of you've got people waiting to save people's lives, and on the other hand, you just technology which you're relying on. How have you found
Yeah.
that?
So this is interesting, right? Because of course, as a person, you definitely want to be, you know what they're going through. You want to be supporting them
Yeah.
the best that you possibly can. And this is actually what the majority of these organizations spend their time. So when you have these meetings with all those people from the space agencies, a big part of the discussion is, well, we know that this is useful, but we know that we could do better. If you could get the information faster, quicker, more effectively, obviously it could have a big impact on people. And how do you solve that problem? That is a big part of it. And so I can tell you, obviously, on the personal side, so one side of things, ideally, if you have the chance, is if you know the people that you're going to support, and normally you distribute the work between the different country members, you try and get to know them in advance, create expectations, tell them, look, when you have a disaster, this is what's going to happen, this is how we're going to support you, this is how long the information could take. But we're still human. When you're waiting for the data and you want it to be there faster, it doesn't make the wait easier. But there is always that understanding. But I also have to say, I mean, the world of satellites and just the capability that is available is growing at a speed that is completely unprecedented. There are new companies, new constellations. Even the existing agencies are launching new capabilities every year. So the velocity at which data is emerging is huge. There is still the factor, though, with this type of situation, that data is often not enough. It has to be data that you can take and transform into information that helps them make a decision, because in the disaster response scenario, you're looking at very short time frames. So there isn't enough time to go, oh, a new data source I haven't used before. How would I get to know which areas are flooded and where to send the rescue teams? That's not the moment to do that. So there is a lot of, there is a certain lag between new data sources becoming available and then going through the processes and through the standards that are required to use them in an initiative like this.
Yeah, so at the end, the data has to make sense before we've even got the data.
Yes, yeah. Well, in the main, in most countries, some countries are super well prepared and they will have teams of analysts that can handle any type of satellite data. But in many situations, you have civil protection agencies who know how to manage disasters if they're given the right information, but they're not experts in these, so they need to be given the information in a way that they can just trust it and act on it, and they don't have to kind of figure out what it means.
That's great. Just another question coming in from Lucy Curtis. Thanks for your question. And she's asking you that could you pinpoint any particular key transferable skill needed to pursue a career in the space industry?
So sure, but do you mean transferable from another field or just from my background? Can we figure this out?
I think she's asking from your kind of experiences, if there's one that's in the space industry, but it could also be broadly used.
Right. Okay. Sure. Yes. So something that I've learned in the space industry. So I would say the space industry is a rather international sector, right? So no matter whether you're here in the UK or not, the people that will use the information that you generate tend to be all over the world. And equally, the data sources that you use will come from all over the world. So learning, again, how different people work, what to expect, how to have effective interactions with them is huge. And I think that can go across so many other areas because we are ever a more global society. I mean, if now you can run a business on the internet in the digital economy where your customers will be all over. So having these understandings really gives you a global view, which can transfer across many areas.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned like having the understanding of people, but how does someone who's not kind of interacted with different types of people learn that skill?
Yes, so I would say if you can, start working with someone who has, and just kind of observe them and watch them and be there with them, but be humble. Also say, I'm very new at these. I'm very interested in working with you. I apologize if I do something that, that doesn't agree. Please be patient with me. People, I mean, again, people who work in an international context, they will understand, right? If you come at it from a point of view of, I'm coming from this perspective, I'm willing to be open and to learn, and then people will receive you. But yes, if you can definitely kind of watch how someone does it that has been doing it for a long time, that's very helpful.
Awesome. No, thank you. I hope that answers your question, Lucy. We've got another interesting question coming in from our YouTube channel. And there's a question saying, has your journey acted as an advantage in getting teams to work differently? Or equally, were there barriers you felt you overcame or still would like to overcome for future people to who are thinking about coming into the industry?
Sure. So I would say yes, having these different and diverse background has been a massive advantage, especially in the later roles, but actually all, where you have to interface both with the people who are experts in the technology. And so being able to have a level of understanding of the technology, giving them the confidence that while you may not know their technology 200%, you have a background that allows you to get it in that way has been very useful. And at the same time, though, interfacing and communicating with the people who use the outputs of the technology, but definitely are not interested in being technology experts, to make it meaningful to them, to actually really understand and take their point of view often. Having had those experiences from before, where I've been both, I've been the technology expert and the user of the technology, really was an advantage in working with teams in the space sector, because then you could see it from the two sides. And I would say there are definitely still challenges to overcome. And one that we're moving towards quite quickly as a sector, but that we still definitely have not nailed down, is that this has traditionally been a sector dominated by those who know technology very well and have the amazing capability to create these fantastic scientific grade products and information and systems, but who are often not very close to the problems that these systems are trying to solve. And so kind of having a more joint thinking from the two sides from the start, rather than kind of going, developing all of this amazing technology and then going, and how do we make this useful for the people later, which has, in the past been the way that things were done. That's a transition that we're going through, but there's still quite a ways to go.
No, thank you so much. I hope that answers your question on YouTube. You were speaking about this earlier, about how the different response units in the disaster units, they act with the different space data that comes in effectively to help them see where they need to go and save lives. But I always ask this question to people who have done PhDs, because in a PhD, of course, it's so refined as what you're studying, and it's so specific. Like, it's a specific application you're really spending so much time on and going into so much detail with. But if we now step back and think about the wide breadth of what satellites do for us, where do you think, so if we step back from like what you've done in your PhD and see the wide application of what satellites are doing for us, where do you see that's going in terms of especially disaster response, and how satellites can actually help us? Because I'm sure there's people in the audience who are probably wondering how satellite data is helping disasters, whether it be. I mean, I'll let you take on the question.
Sure. Yeah. No. Absolutely. Well, and I guess disaster response is probably one of the best examples that actually brings all of the satellite technologies together. So to start off with, the number of disasters that are caused by hydrometeorological causes, so which means weather-related things, is the one that's growing exponentially, right? So we have a pretty fixed number of earthquakes, of volcanoes, etc. That really hasn't changed dramatically over the last few decades. But the number of disasters that we have relating to weather, so droughts, cyclones, flooding is actually the most damaging disaster globally. That has been growing at an alarming rate, in the sense that we have, where we used to have maybe a decade or so ago, 50 major disasters per year, we now have 500. So it's in that order of difference how quickly that's happening. And so for these types of disasters, a key piece of information, which I've already indicated, is weather. So weather satellites and accurate weather, real-time weather information, huge. And there have been really great initiatives recently. So the US, Europe, but also some countries in Asia have actually launched much more advanced weather satellites that give information at very rapid intervals. In some cases, when they're monitoring for emergency response in the matter of minutes. And because the weather patterns are so complex and they're becoming ever increasingly more complex, and I think for those of us who live here in the UK, that's very good proof, because you can look at the weather forecast and half the time It's not going to be that to where you are. But these type of advances are likely to make a huge difference. Now, don't get me wrong, that's the first part of the equation. You still need to then take all this amazing data and much more rich data and make sense of this complex dynamic world that we live in, which is like always, you know, much more complicated than our simplified model. So that's the first part. The second part that is also key is location. So these are satellites that give us information about location or global positioning. So for disasters, and definitely now that the number of people with mobile devices that have the ability to provide location is rapidly growing. So if our global population is circa, as I think we're 7.5 billion, getting close to 8. If I get this number right, but I think the global the number of global devices is between 3 and 5 billion, which means a lot of us have the ability to get location. And this is huge for disasters. And actually, depending on how a country sees disasters, they're actually pushing information out to people who they know to be in a location of risk. So for instance, in the US, if you're in a location that has been detected to be at high risk of flood, you will get a message on your mobile, no matter what provider you have, that says you're at flood risk, please evacuate, right? So this is also a huge part of how disaster response can be improved. And again, the capabilities are only growing in this area. And the part that maybe is the closest to where I've worked is the satellites that take images, right? So when you have a disaster and the disaster has occurred, you very often have a very poor understanding, especially if it's a large one, of what is the situation immediately after. So if it's a flood or if it's a landslide or if it's like the Nepal earthquake that occurred a very vast area, are people trapped that you could rescue? You know, and if you rescue them in the first 24, 48 hours, that has a huge impact on their ability to survive versus if you take 5 days. Are there communities at risk that are fine now, but could be, you know, in a progressive flood, for instance, where it's still raining, but could be at risk tomorrow. And so you need to evacuate them now. Having this information is huge. And depending on where you are in the world or how big the disaster is, you know, just the information that you get from the people there is not enough. It's not nearly enough to understand it. And this is where, you know, getting those images, getting the satellites to take images of the site that will allow an expert to interpret them and to provide meaningful information to say, well, it looks like this neighborhood is cut out. So, you know, if you actually have population information, there are 1,000 people that live there. So this should be prioritized for the rescue teams to go and check out who is there. That type of thing, that is huge. And this is where the new capabilities emerging, just the number of satellites that are being launched every year can really help, because here the timing is key. So getting the information quickly anywhere, wherever this is happening, that makes a big difference.
No, that's great. I think you're doing an amazing job. As someone who's worked on the technical side of things, and if you're working on this disaster response team, what, apart from the obvious, like you have optical data which you can see the visible light, how could you like describe a scenario where you use a different type of data to help a certain situation? Because
that happens all the time, of course. So I mean, since we live in a cloudy country, hopefully this is quite relatable, but a large part of the global population lives in very cloudy places. A traditional optical satellite will take a beautiful picture on a cloud clear day, but if there is cloud, the cloud is in between you and the satellite, so it will take a lovely picture of the cloud, which means if you need information at the time the cloud is there, then you need to get this information some other way. And this is where we have, for instance, radar satellites, so the different part of the electromagnetic spectrum, And actually it's what we call an active satellite. So the satellite actually emits energy, sends energy down to Earth all the way from the satellite. And then the energy gets down and bounces back, and the satellite records what came back. And this type of technology allows you to get information through cloud and through a certain level of rain. If it is very dense rain, it can be a bit tricky. And this is hugely valuable for when you need information quickly over an area that's cloudy. And this can definitely be for an event like a flood, but sometimes also for instance, for maritime type things. So, if there is a ship that has lost, or it's in a place where it shouldn't be, and you need to retrieve this type of information, again, this is very clear, right? Because the ship in the ocean will bounce very different information to the flat ocean surface. So yeah, those are clear examples. And actually, I think the UK has had some really interesting case studies of actually tracking also vessels in the ocean that were suspected of doing illegal activity, and then tracing them back when they tried to take port in the UK, again, using these types of technologies.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. There's a question coming in from Luke, and he's asking, what's the single most impactful project, and what was the problem, and kind of how did you come up with the solution?
Okay, so that is a tough question to answer, because in a lot of this work, it's an ongoing activity, right? So you don't get to see the end of the impact in the short term. So yeah. So for instance, I can give you an example where in the activity relating to the charter, one of the initiatives is actually training teams in other countries to understand the technology and to use it. And I was able to work with the Civil Protection Agency of Chile, who called themselves Disaster Central as a country, because they get every single type of disaster that you can imagine. They get earthquakes, they get landslides, they get floods, they get fires. So I was able to train them in the capabilities of the charter and how to use it effectively, because again, these are processes that need to run fast and smooth. So if you're going to use it well, you kind of need to know how to do it. You can't kind of learn it on the go. So that I thought was very useful, and I could see they actually started to use the capability quite often soon after the training, which then translates in them having better disaster response. And a project that has not concluded yet, but that I think will deliver great impact, was actually under a program funded by the UK Space Agency called the International Partnership Program. And this was a collaboration with the 3 Pacific Island countries, which are heavily impacted by sea level rise and the impacts of climate change. So actually, you probably don't see it depending on how your screen is displayed, but the map I have there, it's actually representing sea level rise globally in the last few decades. And the darker, so red colors are areas where sea level has disproportionately risen compared to other areas. And so if you can see sort of the Pacific over here, you can see they've actually suffered from these disproportionately from other areas. So this project was, and is still ongoing, to monitor the greatest risks related to climate change, but also to prepare plans to adapt to these risks.
That's absolutely great. I hope that answers your question, Luke. And I think we have got through everyone's questions. And thank you so much for sharing so many insights into your career and teaching us something new about satellite technology and how it's helping people save lives.
My pleasure. I'm glad. They were great questions, by the way, so I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, if you have any questions, we still have a few minutes, so we might get a chance to answer them. But another very, very big thank you to you, Elena, for joining us on Space Door Live Thursday night talks. It's been an absolute pleasure having you here. A big thank you to all the audience who stayed with us throughout on Zoom and on YouTube. And I think that's it. I think we'll wrap it up. And I think just once again, a big thank you, Elena.
Again, my pleasure. I enjoyed it.
Awesome. Just a reminder to everyone who's tuned in that we have these talks every Thursday at 5:30 with a space expert. Next week, we've got Mike Curtis-Rouse, who's going to be talking about rockets. So definitely tune in for that one. Stay tuned on our social media channels, or you can watch it live on our YouTube channel. Please do share these videos if you enjoy them with your friends and family, or any space geeks if you know them. Until then, take care, goodbye, and have a great evening. Thank you, Elena. Bye, guys.